All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jamal Cooks. I'm the Dean of Language Arts at Chabot. Welcome to our Chabot Speaker Series. This program is put on with the President's Office at Chabot and co-sponsored with the BEA. And so it is absolutely a wonderful pleasure to have our first speaker for just Chabot. We did do a collaborative effort with LPC in the district with Jeff Duncan Andrade, but today we have Dr. Naila Nasir. And in order to bring greetings to you, I'd like to introduce our wonderful, supportive, fearless president, Dr. Sue Sperling.
Thank you, Dean Cooks. Speaking of wonderful and fearless, I'm tempted to say right back at you. So on behalf of the college and the Office of the President, we are so delighted to have the opportunity to partner with the Chabot Black Educators Association, also known as BEA, in presenting today's distinguished speaker, Dr. Nasir, who is the author of Racialized Identities, among many other scholarly works. She begins, as Dr. Cooks mentioned, our own Chabot Speakers Series, which focuses our attention on issues of race, culturally responsive pedagogy, and diversity. These are all topics that are very, very deep and important for us here at Chabot. They're of profound interest to our learning community as they affect our Black students and those from other communities of color and marginalized communities in general. So again, welcome Dr. Nasir to Chabot College. Consider this your house. Our house is your house. Now Ms. Cynthia Hudson will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Sperling. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Before Dantia does the actual introduction, I'm not sure if Dr. Nasir remembers Dantia, because back in 2002, 3, 4, when I was a track coach at a high school, Dr. Nasir and I did a research project looking at language and literacy in sports. And at that particular time, we wrote the article. It was published in, I believe, Anthropology and Education, if I'm not mistaken, and is widely cited. And Dantia continued with our program, is a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley, where she ran track on a scholarship. She's earned her MPH and is now here with her family and her beautiful daughter and her husband, and they live in the Bay Area. And I thought it would be awesome, Naila, to have Dantia introduce you, because Dantia was a 9th grader at that time during the research project. And I asked her to come and to introduce you to Chabot. Tia.
Awesome, thank you. It's good to see you again, Dr. Nasir. We crossed paths at UC Berkeley. So my husband, Jonathan Nasir, and my dear friend, Elena Neal, told me to tell you hi.
Tell him I said hello.
Will do. Okay, so I'll be reading the bio. And in 2017, Naila Nasir became the 6th president of the Spencer Foundation. She was a faculty member at the University of California, Berkeley from 2008 to 2017, and was selected as the 2nd UC Berkeley Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion in 2015. She also holds the Burgeneau Chair in Educational Disparities in the Graduate School of Education, and was previously the H. Michael and Jean Williams Chair of African American Studies. Nasir joined the Berkeley faculty in 2008 from the School of Education at Stanford University, where she earned the St. Clair Drake Teaching Award in 2007. the author of Radicalized Identities, Race and Achievement for African American Youth, published by the Stanford University Press in 2011, Nasir's research examines the racialized and cultural nature of learning and schooling. She is interested in the intertwining of social, cultural, and political contexts and learning, especially in connection with inequity in educational outcomes. Nasir also published over 30 articles and scholarly journals. In 2017, Nasir was elected to membership into the National Academy of Education. The National Academy of Education advances high-quality education research and its use in policy and practice. Nasir also has been an integral member of the UC Berkeley Resident Faculty Program, where faculty integrate themselves into student life and provide support for students by living alongside them in residence halls, which I remember you doing that while I was there also. In this role, she worked with resident faculty colleagues to promote academic achievement and to create an inclusive and comfortable community that encourages personal growth and development. She strives to integrate her scholarly work with her commitment to community and engaged scholarship. Nasir received her BA in 1993 from UC Berkeley for social welfare and psychology, and her PhD in 2000 from UCLA, psychological studies and education. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I see we went with the long version of the bio there, so hopefully everybody suffered through that. And good to see you again, of course, Dean Cooks. I'm so grateful to be with you all this afternoon and have a lot to share. Dr. Cook said I have 30 minutes, so I'm gonna get through so much of what I prepared in that 30 minutes, and then there'll be some time for us to talk with each other. So I've titled my talk today, well, let me share my screen so I can get the slides up. Let's see. There we go. There we go. So I think the chat is disabled, so you can ignore those instructions there. I've titled my talk today, Education, Race, and Anti-Blackness. I spent a lot of years of my career studying the experience of Black students in schools, mostly in the Bay Area. Some of the work that Dr. Cooks and I did together, as he mentioned, where we conducted the study of teaching and learning in high school track, partially to make the point that the kinds of alienating experiences Black students were having in schools didn't have to be the case. And in fact, weren't the case when it came to how teaching and learning happened in practices outside of school, like track, where students were actually learning quite successfully and even persisting in really tough learning moments. Then later, I worked on race and equity issues from another angle as Vice Chancellor of Equity and Inclusion at Berkeley, where I spent a lot of time thinking about how institutions perpetuate or disrupt inequality and anti-Blackness in particular. So for our time together today, I'm going to share some about how race and anti-Blackness play out in K through 12 school settings, drawing on findings from several studies over several years. And then I'm going to turn to a discussion about how we perpetuate or disrupt racism and anti-Blackness in higher education. Spoiler alert, there may be some parallels there. So this is such an interesting moment that we are in to be thinking about and talking about these issues. We are in the midst of multiple pandemics, COVID-19, systemic racism, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis. And all of these things kind of happening in intersecting ways all at once. And what that has prompted, I think, is a really deep realization of the severity and the consequences of racial inequality in our society. So it's a really important time for us to be thinking about and working collectively on these issues. And I applaud Chabot College for the work that you all have been doing so far on these issues. So I'd like to start with conversations about race in schools by making the point that there's kind of a core conundrum in education, which is that schools as institutions both reproduce social inequality, but they also have the capacity to disrupt it. And so at its best, we're disrupting that inequality that exists in the society around us. And at its best then, education is about freedom. Education is about liberation. mentally, emotionally, intellectually. It's about being self-determined, about developing your unique gifts, and about building a life where your talents are valued and you make a positive impact on the planet. So I hold lofty aspirations for what we can accomplish as educators throughout the K-12 and higher ed systems of education. So I want to start with a story. And this is a story about whiskey, as many good things begin. So a couple of summers ago, I got a frantic call from a dear friend. And he'd read this story in the New York Times about the Jack Daniel's Whiskey Company, his favorite brand, that had put him in a bind. The Jack Daniel's Company was renovating its visitor center. And in doing so, they happened upon some previously lost records. For many years, this visitor center had been telling the story that the secret to Jack Daniel's whiskey was a recipe that Jack himself created with American ingenuity and wisdom and craftiness. He created this amazing, unique recipe for whiskey. And that is the recipe upon which the company was built. So it turned out that in these records that were discovered was information that made clear that the recipe, in fact, was not Jack's creation at all, but rather was the creation of an enslaved person that Jack's family owned, or assumed they owned. And that even further, this original recipe was by an enslaved person that they owned, but that the descendants of this original enslaved man who created the recipe, his descendants continued to work for the Jack Daniel's Company for generations, putting their kind of heart, sweat, and tears into building this company into what it became. And my friend's dilemma was about whether he could still drink the whiskey, which he loved, knowing that it was built on the backs of slaves themselves, who themselves nor their descendants were able to reap any of the benefits of the profits of their labor. And I like to start with this story because I think it illustrates that racial inequality, along with gender inequality and the many other forms of exclusion that are part of our national and global history, obviously existed in the past and has roots in the past, but they also carry forward into the present in tangible and consequential ways. We live with their legacy. And so part of the story of thinking about how race and racism and anti-Blackness exist in our society is to think about the historical continuation of a very long legacy. And one of the ways to think about that is this concept of historical accumulated disadvantage. And that just means that there's this denial of opportunity over many generations, which accumulates to exponentially increase disadvantage and negative outcomes. And I think that, what these pictures on this slide illustrate is one of the most striking examples of how this historical accumulated disadvantage works for me is in issues of housing policy and home ownership. And these two books on top are a couple of books I read a year or so ago that for me really changed my whole thinking about these things. So I recommend both of them, but in the interest of time, I want to tell just the basic story. So both of these books tell the story of the legacy of the real estate and mortgage lending industries around race. And until about the 1960s, there were these tightly guarded racial covenants about who could buy houses in what neighborhoods. And if you were Black across the country, that meant that you were prohibited from buying in safe and high resource neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods you could buy in were made up of lower housing quality stock in less desirable locations. Further, the mortgage loans you had access to, if you could get them at all, had higher interest rates, more restrictive requirements, and fewer legal protections around losing your home. Black GIs didn't have access to the GI housing loans like white GIs, so while white families used homeownership as a lever into the middle class, for Black families, the ability to build wealth through homeownership was greatly constricted. And so Toxic Inequality, which is written by Tom Shapiro, highlights how this historical backdrop set the stage for the 2008 mortgage lending crisis, which essentially obliterated much of the potential to build wealth of Black and Brown families as they had less intergenerational wealth to withstand the crisis and loans that were less desirable. And unless you begin to think that this issue of inferior loans is about class, but not race, I realized sometime after 2008 that I had a subprime loan while I was a professor at Stanford University living in Oakland. So you can think about education this way too, right? That there is over time, and Gloria Ladson-Billings makes this case in a beautiful way, that there are effects of the long-standing denial of education opportunity for Black Americans and other groups as well. I mean, if you think about the long-standing historical legacy of disadvantage for Native American communities, the legacy of boarding schools and kind of forcibly removing children from their families and communities is another kind of very detrimental historical legacy. So the main point here is that what the whiskey story tells us, and what this deepens our understanding of, is when we think about race, inequality, and anti-Blackness, it is not an of the moment thing. It is a thing that has been constructed and reconstructed and maintained through policy over generations. Okay, now that we are all overwhelmed, this is maybe a bit of hope or a bit of reframing, because I think we have tended to think about the costs of racism to Black people, the costs of racism to marginalized communities. And this book came out just a couple of weeks ago by Heather McGhee. And she makes the point that actually, if you look at the patterns in society over time, that racism actually costs all of us. And she opens the book with this story of swimming pools, and talks about how there was a period in the 1940s when it was this great American tradition in cities across America to build these vast, grand community swimming pools. And that this was a part of this vibe of American leisure time, but that when desegregation started to happen, rather than allow Black residents to swim in the pools, many cities drained the pools, filled them with dirt, and were willing to forego this entire resource for everyone just to maintain this legacy of racism. And Heather says in the book that the task ahead then is to unwind this idea of a fixed quantity of prosperity and replace it with what I've come to call solidarity dividends, the gains available to everyone when they unite across racial lines in the form of higher wages, cleaner air, and better funded schools. So she's making the point there that, in fact, contrary to popular opinion, when we have policies across society that create equal structures and access, everyone does well. Everyone does better. This is also true of our higher education institutions, as I'll talk about in a minute. But before I go too much further, let me offer a couple of definitions. What do we mean by race? Race is a concept which signifies and symbolizes social conflicts and interests by referring to different types of human bodies. I love this definition because it makes so clear that race is not a biological thing. It is not a biological marker of any sort. It is a social construct that we imbue with meaning. And in fact, that social construct, from its very beginnings, from the very beginnings of thinking about who was in what racial group, the purpose that served was to allow the allocation of differential resources. So race at its very heart isn't about phenotypical or biological differences. It's about resources and about allocating resources through society. What do we mean by racist? Ibram Kendi makes the point that a racist is one who is supporting a racist policy through their actions or inactions, or expresses a racist idea. In some ways with this definition, Kendi raises the bar on what we view as racism. It doesn't require intentionality for Kendi, and that a racist policy then is any measure, written and unwritten laws, rules, procedures, policies, regulations, and guidelines that produce or sustain inequality between racial groups. A racist idea then is any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to another group in any way. And so he argues that we then must strive that racism is the default in this country, and we actually need to strive to be anti-racist, which he defines as one who is expressing the idea that racial groups are equal and none needs developing, and is supporting a policy that reduces racial inequality. And I'll say more about those ideas in a moment, but I want to quickly define anti-Blackness, and this draws on the work of Kiana Maria Ross, who published this lovely op-ed in the New York Times last year. And she describes, and she makes the argument that anti-Blackness describes the inability to recognize Black humanity, which I think is such a powerful notion. And I'll read from the article. She writes, many Americans awakened by watching footage of Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd by kneeling on his neck are grappling with why we live in a world in which Black death loops in a tragic screenplay scored with the wails of childless mothers and the entitled indifference of our murderers. And an understanding of anti-Blackness is the only place to start. Anti-Blackness is one way that some Black scholars have articulated what it means to be marked as Black in an anti-Black world. It's more than just racism against Black people. That oversimplifies and defangs it. It's a theoretical framework that illuminates society's inability to recognize our humanity, the disdain, disregard, and disgust for our existence. And in some ways, you will see here, the language here is very strong. And I think that reflects the way in which the experience of Blackness in this country is very strong. It's a very strong, visceral experience that one comes up against again and again and again. So then how does racism and anti-Blackness, how are they perpetuated in K through 12 schools? Well, first of all, the obvious, access to everything good. And then Heather McGee has this saying in the book, and I've heard her do a couple of interviews about the book where she says, why can't we have nice things? So I think this mirrors that. So access to everything nice, right, is and the denial of that and the inequality of that across racial lines is one of the core ways that racism and anti-Blackness is perpetuated in schools. So differentials in access to high quality teachers, rigorous curriculum, well-maintained facilities and materials, arts, music, extracurricular experiences, fair, disciplinary, and punitive experiences, and physical and emotional safety. And I will add there that I think we're seeing this kind of in full effect here in the pandemic times. These unequal structures are hitting the experiences of young people in really profound and visceral ways. But they also show up in other places. They show up in our assessment and measurement systems. What do we measure? What do we view as important? They show up in the curriculum and the canon in the form of what's called epistemic violence, or the way in which the knowledge structures you're faced with don't fit with your own kind of internal knowledge structures or your cultural knowledge sets. And they show up in systems failing to see the strength in children and families. And this part in red in the middle is kind of, for me, a really important aspect of understanding racism and anti-Blackness, which is that racism is the denial of basic human needs. And it's when systems deny systematically particular people access to the things that would meet those basic human needs. So as I mentioned, I was going to share some work from various studies. This slide is from a study that I did of African-American high school young men and how they talked about their racialized experiences in school. And the short of it is probably not much of a surprise, but these students, these male students, did see, they felt that every day of their school lives, they were faced with managing the stereotypes other people attempted to pin upon them again and again and again. So they characterized their school life as being about racialized stereotypes and then unjust disciplinary actions that went with those stereotypes. They felt their teachers had low expectations for them and that they were not worthy of care. And so this is a quote from one of the young men who says, when they send us out on a referral, sometimes when they write down stuff on the referral, they kind of like put a little extra on it. Like, you know, even though we didn't do anything like that bad, they try to make it seem like we did a lot worse, which I think is a striking and heartbreaking example of the way in which they felt that their teachers were operating against them and seeing only the worst of them and then emphasizing that worse. This comes from a different study where I was thinking about what is it, you know, if young people see these racial stereotypes as something so central in their lives, and this was true of Black young people as well as Latinx young people. This study looked at middle school and high school students. And so the study was kind of about what do young people do with that? Like, so you're faced with these stereotypes and you know people are thinking about you in particular kinds of ways that you don't find to be true. How do you manage that as a young person? And the study kind of showed that there were 4 patterns to how young people managed being stereotyped. One, some very young kids just weren't aware of the stereotypes at all. That was a pretty successful strategy until it wasn't. Right? And by 8th grade, there were no students left in that cell. Other students managed it by taking up the stereotypes. So you think I'm a loud Black girl, I will be that loud Black girl. Other students managed it by distancing themselves from the stereotypes. So they would say things like, yeah, no, it's true. You know, Black people don't tend to take honors classes, but I'm a Black person and I'm in honors classes. And then other students resisted the stereotypes and just flat out said these were not true and were blatant and called them out as blatantly false. And that final category of students was the most high achieving and the most well adjusted in their school lives. But that kind of requires young people to have access to resources that help them recognize and push back. And when I talk to young people about where they learned to do that resistance, it was never in school. It was always at home, uncles, parents, other family members or family friends. This is these data come from a study where we looked at how anti-Blackness played out in a magnet high school setting, and what students and parents' experiences were there. And they talked about 3 ways, and these were primarily high-achieving Black students and families. They talked about what it meant to be seen as the exception, so Black exceptionalism, so the positioning of some Black students as deserving or exceptional, but others as undeserving as unexceptional, which was like, well, you're different, right? That's a form of anti-Black violence. Other families and students talked about having to choose between academic excellence and culturally safe spaces, another form of anti-Black violence where you can't have both, right, as a parent or as a young person. And then families talked about what they had to endure, this notion of Black enduring, where Black students and families had to live then through the consequences of their choices, whether that choice be academic rigor or whether that choice be culturally safe spaces. And of course, there are institutions that foster both, but they're rare and they're few and far between for Black families. And so one of the themes that comes across really powerfully when you're thinking about race and how it plays out is this notion of narrative and stereotypes and stigmatizing narratives. And I love this really brief video by Trabian Shorters where he talks about deficit frames, which are a key mechanism of racism and anti-Blackness, and which show up in our institutions again and again and again. So I just want to play this brief clip. I think it's set to the right place.
The thing about philanthropy is whether we mean to or not, we have a very negative message towards the people that we say we want to help. I don't run around believing I'm an at-risk this or a low-income that or a high poverty, high crime. Like no one carries around those labels thinking that's how I'm going to face the world, right? Because I know it's not intentional. The thing about having a stigmatizing narrative in terms of the way you relate to a person is it automatically sets them in a place where they're being denigrated for the most part. Intentional or not doesn't matter, you know, they're being denigrated. A friend of mine used to...
I'm gonna stop it there because I think that's the important point for me, that how we frame young people really matters. And when we're using frames that are about deficit, when we frame people by our perception of their weaknesses, that is in and of itself an act of anti-Blackness and of racism. And these deficit frames are super common and incredibly powerful. So when I say deficit frame, what I mean is viewing a group through the lens of lack, focusing on what is wrong with them, often in alignment with historical narratives about the deficiencies of marginalized groups. And racism itself inherently imposes a deficit frame. So people have done work on what it means to have a deficit frame versus what it means to have an asset-based frame, and have argued that deficit frames are needs-driven, problem-focused, externally focused, meaning focused on are focused on how I'm going to fix you, and they focus on what is missing that we must go find. Whereas asset-based frames, and I'm sure Jeff talked about this, are strength-driven. They're focused on opportunities. They're focused on how is the solution to this problem, where does it already exist in people and communities, and what is present that we can build upon. And so I want to skip that. And I just want to say there's another, when we think about education, we did this recent analysis that kind of showed there's deficit-based, which is about keeping the status quo. How do we change individuals, families, or communities so they can participate in and benefit from current systems? But the focus is on changing the families. We talked about strength-based, where there's an opportunity then to reimagine systems, which would ask the question, how do we reimagine systems to amplify and value the strengths of people? But then there's this third category that we've been trying to figure out how to articulate, which is about how we fix systems, but in a tinkering kind of way. It's about how we fix systems to be slightly less terrible. And so we argue that we actually need much more research on this reimagining side and much more focus on what systems would look like if they were truly designed to serve Black families and communities. And what we get much more of is this middle category, which asks, how do we broaden access to current broken systems? So I argue then that radical love is the antidote to this, and that that a focus on how we create systems that values young people, that values the energy, the talents, the gifts that young people bring to institutions and communities is where we have to put our focus. And people are kind of working to articulate that notion of love. We've done some writing about it. And I want to make the connection here between love and freedom and liberation. So Ella Baker says reduction of injustice is not the same as freedom, and that the ultimate and the ultimate goal, this is from Bettina Love's book, of abolitionist teaching is freedom, the freedom to create your own reality, where uplifting humanity is at the center of all decisions. So I think I'm just, I want to say a little bit about how then racism and anti-Blackness are perpetuated in higher education, institutional differences in funding, the many myriad of ways people are othered and told that they don't belong in institutions in subtle and not so subtle ways, how faculty hiring and promotion processes happen, student admissions and retention, how students are positioned as competent or not, levels of representation in course materials, representation in university leadership itself. And then this is super salient right now, who carries the burden of the diversity labor? And as we're moving to these many diversity initiatives and thinking about how on campuses and in colleges, where we're trying to work towards anti-racism and anti-Blackness, who is it that's being asked to do that work? And who is it that's being asked to do that work for free? So I'm gonna move through this a little more quickly and just talk about then, what does radical love look like in higher education? So I would argue that radical love in higher education looks like recognizing formally with policy the added burden on Black faculty and other faculty of color, especially in this moment. It looks like course content that reflects a diversity of perspectives and knowledges. So this isn't just about who has access to courses, but it means what's happening in those classrooms. It means student and faculty diversity that reflects the broader national and local communities. It means rooting out anti-Black cultures in departments, courses, counseling centers across the campus. It means leadership that deeply reflects multiple perspectives and vantage points. And it means hiring, tenure, and promotion processes that reflect those collective values, as well as campuses thinking about how they sit within their local communities and being value added to those communities. And I would just end with saying, now is the time. Now is the time for us to decide that staying the same is no longer worth the cost to our education systems and our children. It's the time for us to understand that even that our privilege damages us all collectively in the long run. And it's time for us to think differently in fundamental ways about the work we're doing in research and education and in our campus communities, and to remember that it is not a zero-sum game. What is supportive for marginalized communities is supportive in general and makes us all stronger, and that we need a new vision that allows us an equitable, sustainable, and deeply humanizing work and communities rooted in love. And I will end there and stop sharing. Thank you.
Wow. Wow. Thank you. Thank you. We can have people, lots of hand claps, lots of hands claps. And if you'd like at this particular point, we're going to turn the chat on and you can begin to pose questions. You can also turn your camera on and pose a question. Maybe raise your hand with one of the with the signs or the symbols. But Naila, as always, I have jokingly said to her, and I mean it every time I say it, that she's absolutely probably the smartest person that I know. Naila gets down. So really appreciate you coming in and sharing the research and the expertise and the wisdom. I do have a question for you as people, as we wait for the chat to kind of warm up and people to ask questions. The one of the last slides when you were talking about equity, right? And this term about whose responsibility is diversity and equity, and I guess one of the questions, and it may have been posed to in earlier, but so what about this idea of how the term equity and diversity, I'll say, and diversity has morphed into different things. I'll just say different meanings, different ideas, right? Because if a group doesn't have a shared vision of what equity is, of what diversity is, then it seems like that work is going to may be splintered and may not be focused in what's trying to happen. So kind of from your research and from your experience, how have you kind of seen the term, let's stay with equity, the term equity move and shift and from what it was supposed to mean to what it is now?
Yeah, I mean, there are no good terms, that there never have been. And I say that because I've just seen over time, any term that starts out with a deep and even a radical meaning, they get co-opted. And we saw that happen with the you mentioned diversity. We're for sure seeing it happen with equity to just mean a kind of general feel-good thing where we bring people together in a fluffy way. Like that's actually not what I mean by the term. And I don't know if there's a way out of the term co-opting to make it mean something less serious and less intentional than it should. But when I say equity, what I'm meaning is the opportunity for every human to fully be respected, to have experiences that meet their full God-given potential, and that there's not kind of systematic harm based on any type of group membership, and that truly the erasure of racism or anti-Blackness is about people being able to fully enact their human potential with that deep humanity at the center. And I say that because for me, there's this tie between racism and the denial of humanity. It's at the core. And so until we have a society where people can have affordable housing, incomes that allow them to meet the needs of their children, access to education where you don't have to mortgage your house or go into deep debt, access to clean air and healthcare, like until you can provide those things as a society, we'll continue to reproduce inequality and continue to devalue some at the benefit of others. And maybe to even say that more, we would devalue some at the cost of all of us. And I think we're seeing that nationally. I mean, we won't be political here, but we've seen these instances of the investment in white supremacy being a liability to all of us. And I feel like we're in this historical moment where if we can see that happening, then we can recognize the counter, which is to embrace a truly egalitarian society where opportunity is made available. That is the antidote to the kind of decline of America that we've seen recently. And I'll just say one more thing as people are warming up in the chat. I attended this meeting a couple of years ago at Columbia, and the meeting was about how universities can be an important part of creating things that create a more equitable society. And they had these different presentations and whatnot. But there were several, and there were people from government, from philanthropy, from nonprofits, blah, 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 scholars. And I noticed there are all these people there who were former Obama staffers for the National Security, whatever it was, Council, the NSA, whatever that is. All these security people. And I was like, why are these national security people, including the guy who was the former head of the CIA, Jack, what's his face? And I was like, why are these people here? This makes no sense to me that these national security people would be here at this meeting about equity. And then as they began to speak, they talked about how the deep and abiding levels of inequality and racism in our society are the key national threat, because it breeds terrorism, it breeds lack of loyalty, it breeds disgruntled society members. And they were starting to see that in kind of the poor white communities. It's just, so that was like mind-blowing to me, that actually this is not just about helping people who have been marginalized. This is about the very health of our democracy. So I'll stop prattling on and see what questions are showing up in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Emerald Templeton wrote you a quick note about appreciating you while at Cal.
There's a question.
Sienna asked, one of your, this is from Sienna, one of your slides spoke on love higher at the higher education level. Can you speak more on some of those practices?
Yeah, I think what I mean by that is that when we all know when we are in a space that loves us, and we know when we are in a space that does not love us, right? And what it feels like to be in a space that loves you. You could think about your grandmother's house, if that's a space that you experience as being really loving. What that means is that you are fully accepted, you are fully embraced, your gifts and talents are recognized, you have something to offer. People hold high expectations for what you're able to learn and accomplish. That's what love feels like to people. So then translate that to what we do in higher ed, right? Do we have spaces where young people join us in those higher education spaces and feel like fundamentally they are seen, they are valued, they are respected? People expect wonderful things, great things of them intellectually. And so the extent to which our spaces do that for people is what I'm talking about. And I think you can think about that in terms of practices, whether you're talking about what happens in the classroom and pedagogical practices that either shut young people down or open up the space for them to be whole. Or you can think about it in terms of policies that say, about student parents, about ESL, whatever the policies might be about that. Policies also create or don't create spaces where people can experience themselves as belonging and being whole and valued. So if we step back from equality as just about access to resources and think about it as access to spaces that fully see you and fully love you, how does that open up the possibilities of what we might do? And I'll give you an example from my work at Berkeley from, this is a good 7 or 8 years ago now. It was a moment when we had a federal government that was very anti-immigrant, and the university decided, a few actors in the university decided to start a resource center for immigrant students. and for undocumented students in particular. And what that did for people who felt like they didn't belong, they couldn't reveal their undocumented status, they were marginalized in the university space, it said to them, you belong here. And they had resources, there were lawyers. So if people had families that were in immigration trouble or issues were happening, there was somebody they could talk to give advice. There were financial aid counselors to help them think about how you pay for this education if you're undocumented. So, and one could say, well, that's maybe an overreach for a campus. But I would argue that in fact, if you don't do that work, we know from the neuroscience that if we don't do that work, if people don't feel loved and held and belonged, they can't show up in your classroom and learn anything. People under threat physiologically cannot engage learning settings openly. So if that's true, then this isn't extra work. This is actually the work we need to do to educate people well.
Thank you. There's another question in the chat from Marissa Trailer, who says, thank you, Dr. Nasir. I was very struck by your use of the term epistemic violence, as it relates to canon. Can you say more about this?
Well, yes, Marissa. Thank you, Marissa, for that question, because I wanted to say more, but I was watching the clock and I was like, dang, I'm going to run out of time. Let me get to the end. So epistemic violence is I wish I could think of a way to say it that's not such a word that trips the tongue. But what that means is our disciplines, math, science, literature, history, our disciplines are built on an assumption of a valuable knowledge base, right? That's the canon, is the idea that there are certain pieces of knowledge that are particularly important and foundational for disciplines. Those knowledges are not culturally neutral. And so this term comes from the work of Megan Bang, who studies the teaching and learning of Native American students in science in particular. And she's made the argument that for Native students in a science classroom, epistemic violence is committed when their ways of knowing about science and the natural world are directly countered and viewed as not being scientifically appropriate. So notions of what is alive differ culturally. Are rocks alive? Is water alive? By some cultural sense making, yes. By standard Western science, no. And so when you are in a space that denies the value of your knowledge, that's epistemic violence.
All right. And Marissa, if that fully answered it, then fine. And if not, you can feel free to ask a follow-up in the chat. We do have a few more moments. Naila, one of the things I'm curious about is that you've been able to work in with elementaries, with middles, with high schools, at the higher education level, with colleges. In your seat now, from where you are working with Spencer, right, in this international, influential internationally in terms of education, and the projects and work that you do, I think that you would probably have I'll say a perspective, kind of a kind of like what's the cutting edge, like what's next. And so if you could maybe just share with us, particularly with us being at a community college, like what do you see like around the corner? You know what I mean? Like what are the things that we should consider and think about? I'm not saying you're one of those, what is it called, a futurist? I'm not saying you're that, but I am saying, like, if you were to look around the corner, what are things that we should be considering and maybe even implementing to be able to best benefit our students?
Yeah. Well, I guess I have a number of different answers to that question. One, I will say that to my mind and from where I sit, community colleges and the expansion of community colleges are a part of our sustainable future. So they are incredibly important institutions to our democracy. And I guess part of what I see around the corner is better funding for community colleges. I think that is got to be a part of this whole package of things. I think it's front and center for the Biden administration. I think it is about creating education pipelines that serve everyone. So that's, and they've been places of innovation. If you look about like the community college system in Miami has, won all of these awards for being this amazing re-entry and entry into higher education. And I think that capacity and that work is happening in lots of places in the country. As far as what's around the corner for teaching and learning institutions like community colleges, I think there will be a real interrogation of curriculum and teaching practices. So what does it mean if we're moving to this place where we know that our society is increasingly made up of Black and Brown people? If that's true, and it is, what does that mean for the teaching force that we need? What does that mean for the pedagogies that we need to learn to do differently? What does that mean for the curricula? And again, if learning is always cultural, which it is, and if learning requires spaces that feel like home spaces, then we have a lot of work to do to make classrooms that are not alienating and judgmental. And so I think that community colleges are well positioned to be at the cutting edge of what that work looks like. I think in particular, there's really been this interesting way that I'm sure you all are a part of around remedial education, and that being a strategy that does not work. And so thinking about how you invite in a classroom, folks with very different kinds of backgrounds and experiences into a learning space together. I think that's also something that we'll see in the future. I'm also super curious with the Biden administration about all this talk around debt relief and what it means to have a society where you don't have to go into deep debt to get a college education, which might impact the transfer rates and the aspirations of community college students around where they're going to, if and where they will complete their 4-year degrees. I also think there's been really interesting conversations about the Pell Grant and about whether the current Pell Grant amounts are sufficient to support students from marginalized communities making their way through college. That, of course they're not. They were set 30 years ago and have not moved. And so I think we can look forward to an increase in the Pell Grant amounts in the coming years from the Biden administration. And I'm super stoked about Joe Biden being in the White House and still teaching college, community college.
Right. Absolutely. Okay. Are there any other questions? I
don't know if it's a bad sign that either I covered it all, or people are just like thinking and vibing, or people are getting hungry and it's about dinner time. So one of those things is happening.
It's a lot of Zoom. I definitely will say this. We appreciate you coming and kicking off our speaker series here at Chabot. You are a very dear friend, colleague, peer. It's been great to be able to watch your ascension in the field and to just continue to do great work that you do. And I think it's important for all different educators at all different levels to hear this message, because I think the more that the message that you're sharing with folks is out in a wider and broader span, then I think that helps us move towards some change. So
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Dr. Sperling, before I turn off, is there anything you'd like to say? I saw you come back on.
Well, I have many things I'd like to say. Most inspiring talk, and one that took me down my own, in very profound ways, down my own memory lane. First and foremost, to my days as a doctoral student in evolutionary biology at Berkeley. And I was so glad that you referenced the non-biological meaningfulness of race as opposed to its uses and misuses, shall we say, as a cultural and often oppressive definition. And the trying to bring forth, I hope somewhat successfully, as a scholar and a teacher, the kinds of issues that evolutionary anthropology began to really promulgate as part of a profoundly anti-racist kind of pedagogy. I'll only say that finally, one of the things that I think mirrors what you pointed out to us about sort of hierarchies, if you will, of valuing of students applies to higher education in some ways that we didn't really get to exactly, but I'd love to sometime. Leaving Berkeley and leaving postdoc and all of that sort of stuff and deciding to teach in the place that was Chabot College, where I encountered Black students and people of color, which I did not encounter in my university teaching much, right? And then coming to understand that not only would I and my colleagues be doing this with a lack of funding that continues to this day to be breathtaking. I mean, our funding is, and yet somehow as the sort of marginalized within higher education, we're expected, like Black faculty and other marginalized folks, to do it all, right? With no money. Am I a little bit fed up with that? Yes. And so there's a kind of, I mean, I think there are some internal assumptions that, that we all need to look at across higher education about the tops, the middles, and the bottoms, if you will. They mirror many of our assumptions about race, our assumptions about value. So I thank you for taking me down that road. It was most inspiring. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful points. Wonderful points. Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. What we're going to do, based on the number of people that would like to stay, if we have enough, we can go to breakout sessions. But Dr. Nasir will be here to kind of answer questions or to be able to just hang out for a little bit. So if you need to go, we know that it's a work day and it's 4 o'clock and some folks still have another Zoom call. So thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
And Kirti, we can, I can do that.